The air in the locker room was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones, making every breath feel heavier than the last. It wasn't the usual pre-fight atmosphere, this was different. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold, almost clinical glow over the scene, highlighting the taut expressions and silent exchanges happening in the corners of the room. Every movement, every glance carried weight, a sharp contrast to the usual chaos of a fight night warm-up. And at the center of it all, sitting motionless on the bench, his fists loosely clenched at his sides, was Daniel Dubois. His eyes, dark and brooding, stared at the floor, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in a war waging far beyond the walls of this room. The roar of the crowd outside was distant, muffled, like a storm just beyond the horizon, but inside, the storm was already raging. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Everything about tonight felt wrong. The fight against Joseph Parker was supposed to be a defining moment, another step forward, a chance to silence the whispers that had followed him since his loss to Alexander Usyk. It was about redemption, about proving to the world and, more importantly, to himself that he wasn't just another contender, that he was destined for greatness. But now, with mere moments before he was supposed to make that walk, something was off. Something wasn't right. And it wasn't just the weight pressing down on his chest or the way his breaths felt shallower than usual. It was something deeper, something that no amount of physical preparation could fix. The voices around him were hushed but urgent. His team moved like ghosts, their usual confidence replaced with a thinly veiled concern. The cutman adjusted his tape for the third time, his hands working methodically but without the casual small talk that usually accompanied his work. His trainer, normally a commanding presence in moments like these, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his jaw tight. And then there was the doctor, standing just outside the doorway, engaged in a quiet but intense conversation with the promoter. That was when it hit him, the realization that this wasn't just nerves, that this wasn't just the weight of another big fight pressing down on him. Something was happening behind the scenes, decisions were being made, and he was the last one to know. His fingers twitched slightly against his knees as he finally lifted his head, scanning the room, searching for an answer in the faces around him. But all he found were guarded expressions, lips pressed into tight lines, and eyes that avoided his. It was a silent confirmation of what he feared most: this wasn't in his control anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but before he could form the words, the door swung open with a quiet creak, and the doctor stepped inside, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one moved. The room held its breath as Dubois locked eyes with him, searching for something, anything that would make sense of this moment. The doctor exhaled through his nose, a brief but deliberate pause, before he finally spoke. "Daniel, we need to talk." The words landed like a hammer blow, heavier than they should have been, and suddenly, the walls of the locker room felt closer than before. He could feel the weight of the statement before the doctor even elaborated. There was something about the way he said it, the way his voice was measured, controlled, as if he was already bracing for resistance. Dubois' stomach tightened. He had been here before, had seen that look in a doctor's eyes, had heard those words before a fight was taken away from him. And now, the same feeling was creeping back in, the same frustration, the same helplessness. He shifted slightly, planting his feet firmer against the ground, his body instinctively bracing against whatever was coming next. But he already knew. He could see it in the way his trainer avoided looking at him directly, in the way the promoter pressed his lips together like he was holding back something he didn't want to say. And most of all, he could feel it in his own body, the thing he had been trying to ignore, to push past, to pretend wasn't happening. The pain. It had started as a dull ache, something manageable, something that could be overridden by adrenaline and sheer willpower. But now, as he sat there, his body stiff with the tension of anticipation, it wasn't just an ache anymore. It was sharp, insistent, spreading like a slow burn through his chest, making it harder to sit still, harder to breathe without feeling it dig deeper. The doctor took a step closer, his voice firm but not unkind. I need you to be honest with me. How bad is it? Dubois didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his gaze drop to his hands, his knuckles still red from the last round of warm-ups, from the repeated impact against the mitts. He could still fight. He had fought through worse. This was just another obstacle, another moment where he had to push through, to show he was built for this. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He knew that no matter how much he willed his body to obey him, there were limits. And if he crossed them, if he ignored the warning signs, it wouldn't just be a loss, it could be something far worse. His jaw clenched as he finally exhaled, his voice quieter than he intended. I'm fine. It was a lie. And from the way the doctor's expression didn't change, from the way his trainers shifted uncomfortably at his side, he knew they all saw through it. But it didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't walking away from this fight. He wasn't letting this slip away. Not again. But the doctor wasn't finished. Daniel, he said again, softer this time, like he was trying to break through the wall being put up in front of him. If you step into that ring like this, you're not just risking a loss. You're risking something permanent. The words hung in the air, thick and unrelenting, and for the first time since this conversation started, a flicker of doubt cracked through Dubois' resolve. He knew exactly what the doctor meant, but he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. He had trained for this moment, had sacrificed too much to let it be taken from him now. But then, just as he was about to argue, to push back against the inevitability of what was happening, the door opened again. A new presence entered the room, someone who hadn't been there before, someone whose arrival changed everything in an instant. The energy in the room shifted. The tension thickened. And Dubois, for the first time, felt something colder than doubt creeping into his chest, something dangerously close to fear. The moment the door swung open, a hush fell over the room, the already stifling atmosphere thickening as an unfamiliar presence stepped inside. Daniel Dubois instinctively tensed, his fingers curling against his palms, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He didn't recognize the man at first, not immediately. But there was something about him, something in the deliberate way he carried himself, and the way his eyes swept over the room like he already owned the space, that made Dubois' pulse quicken. He wasn't part of the usual team, wasn't a familiar face from the promotion, nor was he media. No cameras followed him, no entourage lingered behind him. He was alone, and yet his presence carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. The doctor, who had been trying to reason with Dubois just seconds earlier, turned slightly, his shoulders stiffening in what looked like unease. The trainer, who had been watching the entire exchange in tense silence, shifted subtly, his jaw tightening. Even the promoter, a man who had spent his life navigating the high-stakes world of boxing negotiations, seemed to hesitate before acknowledging the stranger. That was when it clicked. Dubois knew who he was. Not by name, but by reputation. A quiet player in the business, someone who didn't operate under bright lights or in front of cameras, but whose influence could be felt in places where decisions were made in whispers rather than press conferences. And if he was here now, stepping into the already volatile tension of the locker room, it wasn't just to spectate. He was here for a reason. The man let the silence linger for a moment longer, letting it settle, before finally speaking. Daniel, he said, his voice smooth, measured. We need to talk. It was the second time in the span of minutes that someone had said those words to him, but this time, they carried a different weight. The doctor had spoken with concern, with the kind of measured caution of someone who had an obligation to protect an athlete from himself. But this man, his tone wasn't laced with worry. It was something else entirely. Something colder, something calculated. Dubois' stomach twisted slightly, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he held the man's gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but whatever it was, he needed to be ready for it. The promoter cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "This isn't the time," he muttered, but the man didn't so much as blink in his direction. His focus remained on Dubois, his expression unreadable. "I think it is," he replied smoothly. "Because right now, decisions are being made that involve him, and it's only fair that he hears them directly." A cold trickle of unease slipped down Dubois' spine. What decisions? What was being discussed behind closed doors while he sat here, trying to figure out whether he was even going to be allowed to fight? His patience, already thin from the weight of the situation, snapped just slightly. "Then say it," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "If there's something I need to know, say it now." The man exhaled, not in frustration, but in something closer to amusement, like he had been expecting this exact response. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, before finally speaking again. "There's been a change of plans," he said. "This fight? It's not happening tonight." The words landed like a punch to the gut, even though, deep down, Dubois had already felt it coming. He didn't move at first. He just sat there, his muscles locked, his mind working through the weight of what had just been said. "What?" The word barely made it past his lips, but the man heard it. His expression didn't shift. "The medical team has concerns," he continued, his tone still infuriatingly calm. "And there are other factors at play here. The decision has been made. You're out." Dubois' heartbeat thundered in his ears. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "That's not happening. I trained for this. I'm ready." He shot a look at the doctor, daring him to contradict him, to say otherwise, but the man merely sighed, rubbing his temple as if bracing himself for what came next. "Daniel," he started, "this isn't just about readiness. You're hurt. You know it, and so do we. And if you go out there like this, you're risking serious damage." Dubois felt his pulse hammer against his skull, frustration clawing at his insides. He had fought through pain before. Fighters fought through injuries all the time. This wasn't just about his body anymore. It was about his name, his career, the way people saw him. The loss to Usyk had already put doubts in people's minds. If he pulled out of this fight now, if he let them pull him out, what would that do to his reputation? Would they call him weak? A quitter? Would they say he didn't have the heart for this? He shook his head. "I'm not walking away from this fight," he said, pushing himself up to his feet. The pain flared sharply through his torso, but he ignored it, masking the wince that threatened to show on his face. "I don't care what the doctors say. I don't care about your other factors. I'm fighting." The stranger didn't flinch. If anything, his expression darkened, though not with anger, something far more unsettling. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dipping slightly, carrying something beneath the words that Dubois couldn't quite place. "This isn't a choice you get to make anymore." The room suddenly felt colder. Dubois clenched his fists, his breathing tight. "What the hell does that mean?" The man studied him for a long moment before answering, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "It means," he said, "that whether you like it or not, you're not stepping into that ring tonight." The finality in his tone sent a shiver down Dubois' spine. He wasn't just talking about medical concerns anymore. This was something else. Something bigger. And as Dubois looked around the room, at the uneasy faces of his team, at the doctor who seemed to have given up on arguing, at the promoter who wouldn't even meet his eyes, he realized something chilling. This decision hadn't been made for his safety. It had been made for reasons he didn't yet understand. And the worst part? He had no idea who was truly pulling the strings. The weight of the stranger's words pressed against Daniel Dubois' chest like a vice. But it wasn't just the message itself that unsettled him, it was the way he said it, the unshakable finality in his voice, like the fight had already been erased before he'd even stepped foot in the ring. For the first time since the conversation had begun, it wasn't anger that burned in Dubois' gut, it was something colder, sharper. A creeping, gnawing sense that he was standing on a stage where the script had been rewritten without his knowledge, where every move he thought was his own had already been decided by hands he couldn't see. His trainer was avoiding his eyes, the promoter was pacing, the doctor was tightening his grip on his medical bag like he needed something solid to hold on to, and the stranger, the one who had delivered the news like a judge handing down a sentence, was watching him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor regretful. It was just business to him. And that was what sent a deep chill through Dubois' spine. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about medical concerns. It was about control. And someone, somewhere, had just tightened their grip on him without his permission. His fingers curled into fists, his pulse hammering beneath his skin as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice low, steady, but brimming with something volatile just beneath the surface. "No one does." The stranger held his gaze, unflinching, but there was something in his eyes now, something Dubois recognized. It wasn't fear. It wasn't intimidation. It was calculation. Like he was weighing the next move, measuring how much force was necessary to make the message clear. The promoter finally stopped pacing, his expression strained, as if he were caught between conflicting allegiances, between what was right and what was necessary. "Daniel," he said carefully, his voice tight. "It's out of our hands now." That single sentence confirmed what Dubois had feared the most. This wasn't a medical call. This wasn't a precaution. This was something else entirely. His stomach twisted as he glanced at the doctor, hoping just for a second that he might contradict them, that he might stand up and say that this was all a mistake, that Dubois was still in control of his own fate. But the look in the doctor's eyes said it all. He wasn't just here to assess an injury. He had been placed here. A pawn in a bigger game. Dubois took another step forward, his fists tightening. "Tell me why," he demanded. "Tell me who's behind this." The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating whether Dubois was ready to hear the truth, whether it even mattered if he did. Then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, the door burst open. This time, the intrusion wasn't slow or calculated. It was forceful, chaotic. A figure rushed inside, breathless, urgency crackling off them like electricity in a storm. Dubois' trainer turned sharply, his expression shifting from tension to outright alarm. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the newcomer, and for the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. It was the first crack in his carefully controlled demeanor, and that alone was enough to make Dubois' heart beat thunder in his chest. Because whoever had just entered the room hadn't been expected. And that meant that, for the first time tonight, the script had been disrupted. The newcomer was someone Dubois had seen before, someone who had no reason to be here tonight. A cut man from another stable, someone with no affiliation to this fight, no direct stake in what was happening. And yet, the urgency in his expression, the way he was looking straight at Dubois and no one else, made it clear that this wasn't a casual intrusion. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. "Daniel," he gasped, trying to catch his breath, his eyes flicking toward the stranger before settling back on Dubois. "You need to get out of here. Now." The words hit the room like a lightning strike. The promoter visibly tensed, his face paling. The trainer took a half step back, his hands twitching like he didn't know whether to move or stay frozen. The doctor gripped his bag tighter. And the stranger, his expression shifted completely. The calm was gone. And in its place, for the first time, was something dangerously close to irritation. "You shouldn't be here," the stranger said, his voice still smooth, but now carrying an undeniable edge of warning. Dubois' gut twisted. His hands twitched at his sides, his instinct screaming at him that this was no longer just about a fight cancellation. This was something far bigger. "Why?" he asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "What the hell is going on?" The cut man swallowed hard, glancing at the stranger again like he was weighing the risk of speaking. Then, after a long, shaky breath, he finally said it. "It's not about your injury," he said. It never was. The room was deathly silent, the words hanging in the air like an executioner's blade. Dubois barely breathed. Every fiber of his being was wound tight, ready to snap. "Then what is it about?" he pressed, his voice dangerously close to breaking through the thin line of control he had left. The cut man hesitated for half a second too long. And that was when everything erupted. The stranger moved first faster than anyone expected, his hand snapping toward his pocket, a sharp movement that set off a chain reaction in an instant. Dubois' trainer surged forward, reaching for Dubois' arm, but Dubois was already moving, instincts taking over. His body reacted before his mind even fully caught up, years of training kicking in. He wasn't thinking about the fight anymore. He wasn't thinking about Joseph Parker or the crowd outside or the championship implications. He was thinking about survival. The moment the stranger's hand reached his pocket, Dubois lunged. His fist connected with the man's wrist with bone-crunching force, sending whatever he had been reaching for clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the small locker room, and that was when Dubois saw it. A syringe. His stomach dropped. His breath hitched. And for the first time in his career, for the first time in his entire life, the fight inside him wasn't about proving himself. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about getting out alive. Time seemed to stretch, every second a moment frozen in razor-sharp clarity, as Daniel Dubois' gaze locked onto the syringe rolling across the floor. The realization hit him like a knockout punch. This was never about an injury, never about protecting him from himself. This was something else, something far more sinister. His pulse roared in his ears as he pivoted, his muscles tightening, instincts screaming that he needed to move. The stranger, the man who had walked in with quiet authority and stripped him of his right to fight, was no longer composed. His carefully calculated mask had cracked, and for the first time, there was something raw in his expression: panic. Dubois barely had time to process it before the stranger lunged, aiming to recover the syringe, but Dubois was faster. He moved without thinking, his foot striking out and sending the small vial skidding further away, out of reach. The room erupted into chaos. His trainer shouted something, but the words were lost in the scramble. The promoter took a staggering step back, hands raised as if to distance himself from what was unfolding. The doctor, the man who was supposed to be here for medical concerns, was no longer clutching his bag. Instead, his eyes darted to the syringe, his face betraying a flicker of something Dubois recognized instantly. Not fear. Not confusion. Guilt. Dubois' chest heaved as he turned on the doctor, his voice a sharp, cutting demand. What the hell was in that? He didn't need to wait for an answer. The doctor's hesitation was enough. It wasn't just something meant to sideline him, it was something meant to take him out entirely. The cut man, the only one who had broken through the carefully constructed web of control around him, was still breathing hard, eyes flicking between Dubois and the others like he knew this was spiraling far beyond what even he had anticipated. I told you to get out, he hissed under his breath, but Dubois didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, fists clenched, heart slamming against his ribs. He had been trained to read his opponents, to anticipate their next move before they made it. And right now, it was clearer than ever whoever these men were, whatever they were trying to do, they hadn't expected him to fight back. The stranger, now seething, straightened his jacket with a slow, controlled breath, trying to regain the poise he had lost in the scuffle. His eyes met Dubois and the pretense was gone. You were never meant to fight tonight, he said, his voice low, even. That was decided long before you even walked into this arena. The words landed with a cold finality, but Dubois had already put the pieces together. If they had succeeded, if that needle had done whatever it was meant to do, he wouldn't just be out of the fight. He might not be walking at all. His stomach churned, fury building in his chest, but before he could react, the trainer grabbed his arm. "We need to go," he urged, his voice sharp with urgency. Dubois wanted to resist, wanted to demand answers, but the cut man was already moving toward the door, checking the hallway, making sure their path was clear. The promoter, looking suddenly much smaller than he had minutes ago, pressed himself against the wall, as if hoping to disappear into the background. "This isn't just about you," the cut man whispered. "If we don't leave now, you won't get another chance." Dubois didn't need to be told twice. He turned and moved, pushing past the trainer, past the stunned silence of the promoter, past the doctor who had already lost whatever nerve he had left. The stranger's voice called after him, steady despite everything that had just unfolded. "You can run now," he said. "But this doesn't end here." Dubois didn't look back. He pushed through the locker room door and into the corridor, his mind racing, his pulse hammering. The cut man was already leading the way, his movements quick, purposeful. "Who are you?" Dubois asked, his breath still ragged from adrenaline. The man didn't answer right away, just kept moving, guiding them through the maze of hallways beneath the arena. Then, finally, as they rounded a corner, he exhaled sharply and said, "Someone who thought you deserved to know the truth before it was too late." Dubois clenched his jaw, frustration warring with the reality of what had just happened. He had come here to fight. He had trained, prepared, and stepped into this night believing that his biggest battle would be in the ring. But that was the lie they had wanted him to believe. He had never even been meant to make it that far. His name, his future, had been decided by hands he hadn't even known were moving the pieces. And now, as he burst through the exit doors into the cool night air, one thing was painfully clear. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning.